Let's start our second lesson about the composition from the shape. We're going to talk about different kinds of shapes, how they affect the viewer, and how they work in the general composition. We'll also talk about texture. Man sees the shape as a flat outline of an object, even though our experience of interaction with the world tells us that most of the objects exist in 3D space. When we see some image, we notice outlines and object shapes very fast, and it affects our perception of the image. Shape starts with a dot. With movement, it grows into a line. Lines become planes, which create shapes. Basic shapes are circle, square, and triangle. All shapes exist in the space, which can be flat or deep. So we have two-dimensional shapes in flat space or three-dimensional forms in deep space. It's obvious that circle, square, and triangle are 2D. In 3D, there are sphere, cube, and triangular pyramid. They are volumetric. Volume has a stronger effect on the viewer. That's why the effect of an upside-down pyramid will be stronger than from a triangle. Let's get to the different kinds of shapes. We start from the dot. It is the simplest element of the visual design. The dot can be not only round or square, its shapes can be very different. Round dot can have little spikes or the tendency to turn into other geometrical shapes like triangle or square. The dot creates the focus in the frame, highlights an important information, and attracts attention. If there are two dots, then our vision tries to connect them and draws an imaginary line between them. If there are three dots, our mind automatically creates a triangle, four a square. It happens because the consciousness tends to complete what is not there. The unwilling dot connecting process is called grouping or gestalt. A multitude of dots can completely recreate the quality of the color, tone, its transitions and mixes. There is even a type of painting, pointillism. It is painting with dots. The most famous example is Van Gogh. Here is his painting, The Sower, and this is his self-portrait in this painting technique. These examples show that there are plenty of possibilities for dot in motion design, most of which we don't even know yet. The line. This shape also creates a visual composition. It moves the attention of the viewer from one element to another and as a result to the main object in the frame. Different lines enrich the perception and complicate the image. There are always more movement in a line than in a color splash because it's lighter. One line, one level of senses, and several lines make senses stronger. What are the types of lines? Visible line. It is the outline. It surrounds the border of any 3D object. Most objects in real life are 3D. They have the height, the width, and the depth. We perceive lines around these objects. For example, an orange is a 3D object. We see his round shape as the outline of the orange itself. Even though there is no real line around it, our perception creates it. If you put the orange on the same color background, then the outlines disappear, because you can't see the line without tone contrast. Imaginary line, or invisible, has several subtypes. Imaginary lines are created by visible dots. Let's say we see 4 dots, but we can easily imagine the lines that connect the dots into a square. To get lines, the viewer mentally connects only main dots in the frame, not all. They should be different by color or tone to attract the attention. And they also can be in different shapes, curved or straight, triangles, squares, and so on. So what are the subtypes of imaginary lines? The line of intersection of the planes. These lines appear at a crossing of two planes. Any corner of a room creates a line if there is a tone contrast between planes. If we change the color scheme and the contrast between two walls or planes disappears, then the lines disappear too. If the contrast gets stronger, then the lines get more visible too. Axis. Many objects have an invisible axis. We perceive as a line. For example, people, animals, trees. A standing man has a vertical axis, lying horizontal. But not all the objects have an axis. For example, a square, it doesn't have an axis, but a rectangle does. Trajectory. It is the line of an object's movement, like an airplane. The movement of an airplane can be straight or curved. Trajectory can create the same associations as a visible line. Trajectory of a straight line seems structured, aggressive, conservative. Curved trajectories subjectively associate with completely different things: evasive, passive, natural, childish, romantic, soft, safe, flexible. There are two types of these trajectories: visible and virtual. Visible trajectories. When some object move, this object leave a visible trace. An airplane leaves a trace behind it, or a skier leaves a trace on the snow. In reality, these are not lines, but they seem like lines from a distance, traces that show the direction of the movement of an object. The second type is virtual trajectories. Most of the objects don't leave any visible trace behind them, but create an imaginary line of their movement in our head. A bee or a car, for example, doesn't leave a visible trace. The line of their movement exists only in man's head. Linear motif. Any objects of any shape we can imagine as several imaginary lines. It is called linear motif. It can be a combination of round, vertical, horizontal, or diagonal lines. Linear motif can increase or decrease visual tension in a sequence of frames. It doesn't matter if it is a fast-driving car or a quiet talk. To control this tension, you can create the lines contrast, put them closer or further from each other. There are 8 possible directions of the object on the screen. Each of these lines would have a visual effect on viewers. You can make a storyboard of linear motifs to control that movement. In composition, the attention of a viewer concentrates at real or imaginary crossing of the lines or the fracture of the lines. Sight moves to a point of the line's crossing. The more the point of crossing moves outside the frame, the less attention it attracts. The more points of crossing there are in the frame, the more the illusion of depth. When you add a second or a third point of crossing, you increase the sense of a third space. There are other types of lines. Based on the direction in the space, there are vertical, horizontal, inclined, wavy, and curved. I'm talking about the shape of the line and not the drawn line. Okay, first, horizontal lines. They symbolize calmness and balance. A horizontal line subjectively seems thicker than the same but vertical. A horizontal rectangle looks solid and heavy, but a vertical one seems lighter and movable. A river, the horizon, sleeping people, a train. These are examples of horizontal lines in composition. Such a calm composition can be boring. To avoid it, you can add some vertical lines, some trees, a bridge, and so on. Second, vertical lines. A separate vertical object like a tree and a tower seems simple and relentless. You notice it immediately and it visually dominates over any horizontal and other linear structures in the frame. A standing man attracts attention not only because of its psychological significance, but also because it is a vertical object. Clear vertical elements create the atmosphere of greatness, triumph, and calmness. If there are too many vertical objects in composition, then you need to balance it. Usually a good composition with vertical elements has also horizontal ones and they cross one another. If in such a composition you increase the proportions of the vertical object, it would dominate or become the main element of the frame. Third, inclined lines. A composition built with diagonal lines is more filled with the life energy than the one made with vertical or horizontal elements. The highest potential is in a diagonal line. We perceive a diagonal line as moving except if the angle is too little. Fourth, S-form lines. An English artist, William Hogarth, was talking about 7 types of curved lines, and one of them he called the line of beauty. It reminds a woman's shape and looks like S-form line. It can be used to represent flames or waves, for example. And fifth, curves. Curves in composition are usually used to move the viewer's eyesight towards the main element of the frame. A straight line makes the eyesight move from A to B in the shortest way possible. Curve also links different elements in one complicated structure. The advantage of the curve is in smooth transitions that make eyesight moves easily. Rocks, a road, a city skyline, and so on. These are examples of curved lines which put together elements of composition. If you repeat curves with particular space between them, then viewers' attention will be not only on the curves but on the space between them. You can increase the expressiveness of the composition with curves if you repeat same structural elements or use color contrast. That would create a rhythm. That's how you can use lines in your composition. Now let's talk about the third main shape in composition. It's a square. It is a complete, solid form. Sometimes it can be heavy. This form is not about movement and even less about flying. Squares subjectively look like straight, industrial, organized, unnatural, grown up, and rigid. There are some visual illusions with squares, and you should know them when you work with squares. For example, a geometrically accurate square seems lower than it really is. So optical square should be a little higher. It happens because our eye tends to increase everything horizontal and perceive the vertical less. Also, if you divide the shape horizontally into two parts, the bottom would seem smaller. Fourth is triangle. It is an active shape. It brings possibilities for movement. Because of the diagonal lines, we usually describe triangle as aggressive, dynamic, angry, chaotic. Remember that these characteristics are subjective. Triangle with the top up is stable and top down is very unstable. There is an interaction of oppositions in this form, and we can use it to create some images. 5. Circle. The symbol of nature, earth, the world. That's why terms like good, life, happiness often associate with circle forms. Geometrically accurate circle seems horizontally stretched, same thing as with a square that I told before. The same circle can look different based on its position on the plane, light and flying at the top or heavy at the bottom. It is more visible with a black background. Okay, that's it about main types of the shapes. But I want to say a few words about one more shape because it is popular in motion design and UI design now. I'm talking about amoeba shape that creates an effect of an abstract splash or liquid. Instead of precise transition, it creates the splashes of colors which move on the screen and transform into different shapes. When you work with abstractions, you should remember about their uncertainty and complexity. People see them based on their personal associations. Also, the excess of information prevents the understanding of the message. That's why simplicity and accessibility are so valuable in design. It is obviously a new and interesting trend. Check some works of Maxim Zhestkov, for example, to see how he creates vivid design with seemingly empty, abstract forms. Changing shapes. Every geometric figure isn't only used per se. You can use them to give a clear, specific shape to ordinary life objects and to make them more geometric. To achieve this, there are such methods as stylization and transformation. Shape stylization is actually altering a realistic object to simplify it and to make it more comprehensible for viewer. Pretty much any flat animation cartoons are the most glaring example. People bury them every year and they're still very much alive. Drawing and trends change, but the shape animation itself has been an autonomous area in motion design for a very long time and only gets better over time. Here, within the lesson dedicated to shape, we're only speaking about shape stylization, whereas in fact, stylization itself is a really large, separate subject. It can be based on manner, painting genre, historical period, and so on. Well, for shape stylization, you should identify the most specific features of the object and figure out what's the most important thing in the character or location, and then put the needless details aside. Stylize based on your own existing principle and some injected feature. and then use geometry, spots, speckles, and lines to indicate this new stylized object and to bring some life to it. Transformation is changing the object's shape towards some geometric figure or towards being simpler or more complex. Stylization and transformation are normally used at the same time. These methods complement one another and develop the key idea of the project. They also form the basis of morphing, a method used in motion design to smoothly convert one element into another. This is a great way to combine different ideas or to make a smooth transition from one idea or scene to another. Morphing allows to show more in less time. An interesting morphing creates a wow effect for the viewer. Okay, this is all about the shape topic, and we'll dedicate the rest of this part of the lesson to another object's property in composition, the facture. Facture is the visual and tactile quality and treatment manner of the surface. This mainly means the feel we describe when looking or touching the object surface. Visual means how we see the surface, smooth, ribbed, or relief, whereas tactile means the sensation when we touch it. For instance, rough, smooth, ribbed, or prickly. To avoid confusion, let's see what's the difference between facture and texture. Texture is the visual and tactile quality of the object's inner structure, its material. This means we recognize what material it is by sight or touch, whether it's wood, metal, glass, fur, concrete, or plastic. However, we usually perceive a facture visually, how it reflects or absorbs light, and by touch, moving hand across the object. When we touch some facture or material, we keep the surface feel in our memory for a long time and then easily recall it. We can remember associations inspired by a specific facture for years. For example, we more associate aggressive and cruel images with smooth and pricky factures than with soft and fluffy, while soft and fluffy factures tend to be associated with peace and quiet. Along with color, facture has a physical characteristic and aesthetic expressiveness. Physical properties of facture are smoothness, roughness, slip, unevenness, fluffiness, softness. It depends in many cases on technical treatment of the material, twigged, kneaded, polished, and so on. Facture can move the audience in different ways. It can be nice or unpleasant, joyful or boring, delicate or prickly. Combined with the shape, it reinforces the effect on the audience and their feelings and triggers specific images, memories, and associations. We're now looking at works of Rolando Berry, an English designer that made perfect examples for exploring shape and facture. Make sure you'll watch his still lives after this lesson and monitor your feelings. Which pictures move you? In what way? What feelings they cause and why? Coherence between shape and facture is one of the essential issues a designer should resolve. For instance, the author needs a heavy and immovable shape for a specific image. This means that facture has to respond to that task. Ragged stone, reinforced concrete with stamped lining on it, unpolished metal. If you need a light and romantic image, material or combination of materials you choose should fit this image and shape. Silken fabrics, fluffy fur balls. Every composition has its own character. For example, metal and glass are used in modern broadcast design. If we speak of 3D, there also should be coherence between facture, color, and light. For instance, you need some yellow to create an image. However, yellow can be glossy or matte, have a pricky or viscous picture. Facture can make it heavy or light, thus enhancing the image. A facture colored or lit unconventionally, like a sculpture illuminated with a dark neon light, can be a stylistic technique and draw attention to the video. To evoke physical feelings from factures, the art theorist Johannes Itten, we already know, wrote in his book Design and Form about making his students exercise. They found objects with the most extraordinary factures and made compositions out of them. To do this, they ransacked their granny's lockers, rummaged in kitchens and cellars, combined craft workshops and dumps by the factories. They plugged into an absolutely new environment of rough chunks of wood and wooden sawdust, steel cutting, feathering, glass, foil, and plenty of other unimaginable textures. Thus, they developed a flair to feel the material manually and discover new factures and textures. Students noticed that a wood can be fibrous, dry, rough, smooth, or furrowed, and the metal can be hard, heavy, glossy, or matte. And so they began to find ways to reproduce those in a picture. This is how you learn to express your ideas in a more natural and detailed way. Working with factures and textures teaches us to reproduce visible surroundings using its characteristics. Similar objects gain their own individual facture character. This can result in some brand new techniques for picturing subjects like a holiday, news, sports, art, etc. Reproduction of such factures in graphic or motion design intensifies the power of observation and the sense of material. And so we come to composition. Let's begin with composition factors. Why composition is so important and what affects it. The first factor lies in the rules of visual perception. To see doesn't only mean to automatically capture the image. It's perceived in an integrated way, so a good composition's goal is to structure all the information in the frame so that our brain could grasp it easily and comfortably. The number of elements we can perceive at the same time is limited, and will take differently even those 5-6 elements, depending on the power of our attention. Sometimes you watch a cool motion and suddenly you catch yourself miles away and probably have missed something interesting, and then you reverse it and watch again. To hold the audience attention, you should group and arrange the objects on various grounds. If visual elements fall into one group based on proximity, the same size, movement direction, or shape, they are seen as a whole. Therefore, when we build a composition, we should create connections between the different elements. The first criteria to connect the elements in the frame is similarity in their location. This is one of the easiest and oldest ways to arrange a visual space. For instance, this principle underlines arranging the stars into zodiacal constellations. And when it comes to composition, this is the way foreground and background objects are connected. Objects that have similar size are also seen as a single entity or figure. The simplest example is filming a mass scene or a crowd. You can not only group the objects together by their size, but also highlight an object or a person among the others, giving it or him some distinctive features. Our perception tends to reduce everything to simplest shapes. The simpler the figure, the most it stands out from the intricate background. Those straight lines are mentally continued. Curves that form something similar to a circle are perceived as a whole circle. We've been over this in our previous lesson about the shape. Grouping the objects by color is another effective way to build composition. The same color integrates the objects in the frame even if they are fragmented. In musicals, dancers in a group scene are often dressed alike to enhance the unity of their moves and to highlight the main character that wears contrast-colored clothes. The second factor that affects a composition is frame orientation. It was only 10 years ago that we wouldn't even consider such a thing. A video frame could only be horizontal. However, now that social networks and different video formats have developed, you should initially keep the frame orientation in mind, and sometimes a project requires building a composition for all the three formats. That's why I'll tell you not only about horizontal orientation, but also about square and vertical ones. Let's start with horizontal orientation. This format has always been the most convenient and adjusted to human eyes, as this is the way we see the world. It's often used in photography for landscapes or elements enclosed in large spaces. Indeed, it's better to photograph landscapes holding the camera horizontally. That's also true for architecture, group portraits, or still lifes. Although horizontal orientation is habitual, it's not as universal as it seems. The thing is, the frame orientation should ideally support the composition and the shot structure. This means it's not about the frame orientation, it's about what you want to put in this frame. By the way, a horizontal video is also great for social networks. It's especially better for Facebook than a square one because the net is more geared towards text content. And when it comes for Instagram, you should just carefully choose the cover for a horizontal video to prevent a square aligned video from having obviously cut parts on the image. Square format. Due to Instagram, square format has been intensely evolving for some years now. It enchants the video's expressiveness and makes the picture more static and balanced. It's actually perfect for symmetric compositions and abstract forms. This is probably the most universal format. Architecture, landscapes, portraits also fit well in a square. Inside a square, the viewer's gaze moves circle-wise, not side to side or top to bottom. That's why it's good to put the object in the center. It gets surrounded by less space, which helps to stress its details, and besides, it creates depth on the screen. A perspective background is also more fit to the square format than to any other. Also, diagonal lines, especially the ones at the angle of 45 degrees, have a very powerful effect on viewer in a square format. Vertical orientation. Vertical format is the newest one. It's been evolving for only a couple of years and used in video stories in a few social networks and also in Instagram IGTV. Our natural horizontal side gets blocked by a vertical object, so we scan a video from top to bottom, which makes us pay more attention. Also, a vertical video covers the entire screen area so that no feed competes against it. Why is vertical video getting popular? The thing is, we hold the phone vertically and turning it every time we watch a video is just not convenient. Besides, when it comes to stories format, it's more noticeable to subscribers than the general feed that is packed with posts. In the next couple of years, vertical video is going to develop even more rapidly. Along with traditional vertical photography and posters in graphic design, this format is perfect for vertical compositions, especially portraits, but it's also good for highlighting a single vertical element from its surroundings. Our eyes would feel more comfortable looking at a vertical formatted object if it's shifted towards the top of the bottom of the frame. And it's better to locate at the bottom as this creates a sense of stability. A linear perspective would work great for creating a frame depth. It has to be horizontal to support the perspective depth. Factor 3. Eye movement within frame. Alright, we look at a horizontal frame, for instance. We only can focus on its small part, so you should route the eye movement within the frame and plan the start point and the finish point of that route. Point A is the main subject for the start. It is a perspective frame. Sight normally moves in a zigzag line. It should move towards the main subject of the frame, then weight that subject against the other elements and finally come back to the start point. Thus, there always has to be a place that attracts attention straight away. There has to be a main character in the composition. Visual guides. The side's path shouldn't be too pronounced or it might compete against the main subject. Positioning of small and large objects, light and shadow edges, color connections can all act as a visual guides. The essential requirements are that visual guides should lead up to the main subject before being led away to the rest. A well-designed composition will encourage the second and possibly third circuits. Visual guides capture the eye and lead it along a specific course. They must bring it to point B, not remain unfinished. If the guides accentuate an object that causes no interest, the audience will be confused and annoyed, which is unacceptable. So, a frame has a main character that is some image in the middle, figure or form, and it's not good if the background is overstuffed. Factor 4. Figure and background. You can focus either on figure or on background. Let's recall one of the masking ways from the animal world. Deceive the observer and don't let him know the figure from the background. Many animals confuse their chasers and melt into the environment background. Such a confusion can also occur on the screen if you don't split figure and ground correctly. How do you control the figure-ground relationship? You should accentuate the figure using light, brightness, color, texture, position, etc. Meanwhile, ground details shouldn't be able to compete against the figure within the site. Figure-ground contrast can be used as a stylistic technique for shifting the plot focus or while working with abstractions. Visual accents can swap over between figure and ground so that viewers' attention shifts from figure to ground and backwards. To do this, you should move the accents to other form, color, or contour on the ground to make it dominate over the figure. Composition center. We've learned how human eye perceives the composition and moves along its points. Now let's figure out how do we create that main accent that will hold the audience attention and convey the idea of our project. To do this, you should create a composition center in the frame. How to do this? What factors should be taken into account? What methods to use? Alright, location. To create a composition center, you should remember how visual perception of a plane works. Composition center is normally located in the active central part of the frame. You can move it left or right, up or down from the middle if you want to make the plot more fraught or expressive. Shape. You can highlight the composition center with a specific shape using shape contrast. This is the way you can underline some vivid subject's characteristics and basically make a really spectacular image. One more way is to put a complex silhouetted element among simpler ones so that it grasps more attention than a group of simpler elements. Its complexity will make it dominant. Size. This method accentuates the main subject using its size. I mean by making it the smallest or the largest element. Color. A really popular method to identify the major subject is to make the composition center the most actively lit, the most contrast, darkest, or the lightest. Basically to use one of the 7 types of color contrast that we've already learned. Composition pause. This is the last and the most complicated method, and it requires a good professional training. Let's look at 2 of the most popular ways. First is to create a movement towards the center that is not highlighted by shapes. It's done by using rhythm, a balancing tool I'll talk about later. Second is to put elements of similar shape, color, and facture around the center without any accents, so that the composition will be basically a frame. Composition tools. To create a balanced composition, to bring together all of those elements we've learned, we need some special tools. They are rhythm, contrast, nuance and unity, ratio, scale, grounding, and perspective. Rhythm. This is a really powerful tool as it shows the connection between human and nature. Many processes in our life are cyclical. A man feels the rhythms of his heart and breathe, moves in a rhythmic way when walking, running, and dancing. Any work we do is related to rhythmic movements, that is, repeating. Rhythm has the following objectives: arranging the composition and making it dynamic. To create a rhythm, all the elements should move continuously in a specific direction. The clearest rhythm emerges when that direction matches the eye scanning movement and goes from left to right, same way as we read a text. Indicators of rhythm. Repetition of scenes, elements, or forms, along with regularity of their pattern, are the most important indicators of rhythm. Rhythm literally means regularity and measure. It's based on repetitions and concordance of dots, lines, geometric forms, spots, volumes, as well as various ratios, factors, and colors. Rhythm dynamics is achieved by regular rotation of homogeneous items and space. Types. Rhythm can be simple if a single parameter changes, like shape, color, factor, or distance between the items, and complex if same happens to several parameters at the same time. For example, if a shape alters along with color saturation or the distance between some elements changes along with the reduction of form that also changes its factor. Rhythm tools. Rhythm can be expressed using all the visual tools, so it was divided into three types: shape rhythms, dots, lines, spots, and their combinations; color rhythms, achromatic and chromatic; and factor rhythms. A factory assembly line can be an illustration of several shapes' repeated pattern. Methods. You can try 4 ways of creating a basic rhythm by moving some object. 1. Moving in and out of the frame. 2. Moving ahead or behind another object. 3. Moving and stopping. And 4. Changing direction. Rhythm adjustment is a fairly complex process. To make it balanced, consider the rhythm in an integrated manner within your entire project. Plan and combine it through the whole story, starting with frame, then every scene, and finally the project altogether. Contrast, nuance, and unity. Contrast, nuance, and unity help make the composition balanced and uniform. They allow us to create images, to trigger associations, and to set up the emotional mood in our work. Contrast and nuance are related methods. The distinction is just whether the difference between the properties opposal is large or small. Given that, they have different objectives. Contrast is a large difference whether nuance is a minute one. Their effects will differ at about the same scale. If you need a strong visual exposure, commercial for instance, you mainly use form, color, or factor graphic contrast. It's contrast that allows us to quickly read a topic, info, or plot. Whereas contrast is changing the qualities to the most and nuance to the least. Unity is repetition of these qualities. To create a contrast or a nuance and make it work, it should have a couple for comparison. For example, a big item and a little one are contrasting as well as round and square, black and white, fast and slow, smooth and rough, etc. Once we have this comparison, we also have a ratio of white to black, little to big, and so on. Proportions. In-frame proportions enable to split the space in such way the image would be easier to perceive. Proportions define the ratio between a whole and its component parts. Artists and architects from different periods invented various methods or principles to concordantly split a space and embed an image into it. I'll tell of 3 of the most common methods. They are the golden ratio, the rule of thirds, and the modular grid. The golden ratio principle. This principle emerged in the Renaissance and was also referred as divine proportion. The term itself was introduced by Leonardo da Vinci, who had been actively working on proportioning system. Notre Dame Cathedral, St. Basil's Cathedral, and the Pantheon are built on this principle. Golden ratio's unique feature is that it's literally everywhere in nature. Cornflowers spiraling, construction of shell and egg, ratio between lizard's body and tail, and so on. Many believe it to be a perfect proportion formula. It's based on the proportion and numbers of Fibonacci, an Italian mathematician. Fibonacci numbers form a sequence such that each number is the sum of the two preceding ones. So 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, etc. Following this pattern, a frame is divided into parts in such way every subsequent part doubles compared to the preceding one. Thus, squares and rectangles form a corridor where curves are embedded. In a composition based on a golden ratio, all the key visual elements are located in a specific section of divided frame. The rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is basically simplified golden ratio. It's really popular because it's easy and illustrative. This is nearly a standard of frame split. For instance, almost every camera viewfinder and frame arrangement in mobile phone has agreed based on the rule of thirds. Frame is figuratively split into 9 equal parts using 2 horizontal and 2 vertical parallel lines. The important parts of composition, subjects or guidelines, should be placed alongside these lines or at sets of intersections that are sometimes called PowerPoints. Such an alignment makes a composition more energetic and expressive than just putting the subject in the middle, and also attracts attention. If the frame has a single object, you should preferably place it on the left, as we're accustomed to view the images from the left to right, just like reading. If there are several objects, you should put the dominating one in right lower point, because this enchants the perception of the recent information received. Modular grid. Modular grid is very common in typography and web design. It acts as a framework structuring the text and the image. Framing a shot. Grounding and shot size. Grounding and changing shot size are two more composition tools. Shot is a series of frames that runs for an uninterrupted period of time. Framing means dividing screen space figuratively to place the objects correctly and to reproduce action and movement. Shots can be categorized by field size, by replacement, and by their meaning. I'll tell you about the most important categories, which are by field size and by placement. Close-ups and wide shots. Close-ups attracts attention, focuses on details, and prevents minor elements from arranging into a coherent composition, as it would complicate the perception. It's easier to identify the main subject and grasp the information in a close-up. A close-up indicates the setting faster than a wide shot or an extreme long shot. A wide shot shows the object's interconnection, helps to set the mood or to express one's feelings. It is harder to compose, as the wider the frame space, the more elements, luminescence and chrominescence ratios, and contrast there are, and the harder is to achieve the visual integrity. There is a Hollywood saying that it's the close-up that tells the story, and it's the wide shot that sells the picture. Alternating wide shots and close-ups is a good way to make the story more exciting and to create a rhythm inside it. However, TV, for which we make many of the projects, is generally a close-up media, foreground and background. Grounding characters and objects increases the difference in their sizes and creates an additional plane between them, and thus makes the frame look deeper. You can achieve a particularly strong sense of depth developing a synergy between color, vertical and horizontal directions, and grounds. Space is generally created using 2 grounds, although they can be up to 5. Relationship between the objects should continuously change to keep our attention on the frame and to make an eye constantly find some new structures or visual contrasts. This is exactly what an attractive and elegantly structured foreground does. As we have said before, contrast in tone, color, shape, or texture work well in this case. Composition will be really engaging if there are both perspective and structured two-dimensional space on the foreground. One of the simplest way to assess the quality of composition is to look at the image with half-closed eyes. This allows you to distinguish the main components and at the same time makes the minor details indistinct. Perspective. In this lesson, we'll also look at perspective as a representation technique for objects in space. Perspective is essential for motion design. You can't build a good 3D scene correctly without it. Some researchers believe that flat image is initially simpler for human sight. Children and some tribes cut out from modern civilization can be a good example. And the perspective we're all accustomed to results from long-term development of human intelligence. Perspective as a technique emerged during the Renaissance as a realist trend in visual art flourished at the time. We'll look at two of the most common types of perspective, which are linear and tonal. Straight linear perspective is based on an immobile point of view and involves a single vanishing point on the horizon line, with subject size decreasing proportionally the further away they are. To highlight a linear perspective, you should contrast the sharpness of foreground and background to the maximum. Besides, you show the foreground as close as possible and put the objects in the same distance from one another. If there are no closely located objects, perspective will be barely seen and the image will be null and flat. Tonal perspective is displayed differently. Distant objects aren't sharp, their contours are vague. There are no clear light and shade effects. Background objects will be lighter and not as bright as the foreground ones. In nature, tonal perspective is caused by natural qualities of the air. It's never perfectly transparent. Tonal perspective depends on clean air, dust, smog, smoke, humidity, and wind. For instance, it's easier to spot in the city rather than in the countryside. Outside the city, the air is cleaner and more transparent, so the objects should be far off to be less bright. Balance in composition. Balance is a state of composition in which all its elements are coherent. Balance depends on overall arrangement, composition center, rhythm, as well as on color, tonal, and factor ratios between all these parts and the whole. Balance is different in symmetric and asymmetric compositions. Symmetry itself doesn't guarantee a balance, although it's much easier to balance a symmetric composition than an asymmetric one. A well-built symmetric composition is easily grasped, no matter how complex, and it's much simpler to focus on, whereas asymmetric one sometimes requires more time for comprehension. The most popular types of symmetry are refractional symmetry with vertical or horizontal axis, point symmetry, and radial symmetry. Asymmetry has increased early in the 20th century. Because of its complexity, it makes you more attentive to the plane and the elements arrangement. Asymmetric composition is harder to balance, but it has a wider choice of visual tools, such as color and its intensity, form and figure, in-plane orientation, facture, as well as balancing tools, rhythm, proportions, contrast, nuance, scale, grounding, and perspective. Dissonance. I'm going to finish this composition lesson with a topic that heavily contradicts most of the rules I told you about. That will be dissonance, which is actually disrupting the harmony that we strive so much. In this concept, compositional elements deliberately offset in order to create visual tension and a scene of incompleteness. Dissonance entered compositional technique by the close of the 20th century. To achieve it, you should cut off part of an object by the frame to imply that the action continued outside the image. Such incompleteness, along with outward focus, set up a curiosity in viewer and make him complete the image outside the frame in his mind. This technique is called a hard cut-off. Friction and conflict that are set up can convey a strong sense of unresolved tension, as well as creating interest and involvement. Besides, a dissonated subject has stronger dynamic tension. Though you still need some balance here, or your composition will fall apart and turn into a pile of random elements. Classic composition principles aren't always consistent. Projects with no visual novelty pall very soon, so we can enhance the interest to our image by stepping off the strict rules. If balance is a full stomach, then dissonance is an appetite that needs to be satisfied. Well, that's pretty much all I can tell you about composition.